Good morning, everybody, and thank you for your patience. And thank you also for joining us today. My name is Faiza Badnos Busari. I'm the Regional Program Manager at SIHA, the Strategic Initiative for Women on the Horn of Africa. SIHA, for those who do not know us, is a feminist grassroots-led organization working in the Horn. We work in Sudan, South Sudan, Somalia, Uganda, Djibouti, and the Somali region. And of course, we work on issues of gender justice. So it's a pleasure to welcome you here to the discussion on countering anti-gender backlash, pathways to law, policy reform, and access to justice. The conversation brings together feminist leaders, legal practitioners, and advocates from across the Horn of Africa to reflect on the challenge that is becoming increasingly visible globally, the growing backlash against gender equality and women's rights. Across the Horn of Africa, the struggle for women's rights is increasingly becoming a struggle to access to justice itself. We are seeing coordinated efforts to roll back legal protection, undermine feminist movement, and restrictive civic space. These dynamics are not abstract, and they are not abstract policy debates. They have very real consequences for women and girls seeking justice, safety, and equality. In the Horn, these trends also intersect with conflict, political instability, militarization, and the shrinking civic space, creating particularly difficult environment for women human rights defenders and survivors seeking justice. Let me briefly share some examples. In Sudan, the conflict has been accompanied by widespread and systematic sexual violence. Conflict itself has become a form of backlash and regression of rights. We know that during conflicts, nothing happens and nothing operates. So women and girls are facing unimaginable violations, including sexual violence, often in the area where formal justice systems has collapsed. Survivors must navigate displacement, insecurity, and stigma while seeking accountability. In many cases, feminist organizations have had to step in to document these crimes, provide legal support, and pursue accountability through alternative and international mechanisms. Looking at Somalia close by as well, feminist organizations advocating for legislation to protect women, such as law addressing sexual offenses or harmful practices like female genital mutilation, they often face strong political and religious backlash. Legal reforms efforts are frequently contested, delayed, or reframed through narratives that portray gender equality as foreign or culturally incompatible. But if we also look closer to Ethiopia and the other parts of the region, which we're also seeing globally, is that women human rights defenders and activists are increasingly operating in environments where civic space is constrained. Legal advocacy and public mobilization becomes significantly more difficult when institutions are weakened and when those pushing for the reforms are targeted themselves. For example, late last year, 7-year-old Haven was murdered and raped in Ethiopia, and women-led organizations mobilized to hold a press statement demanding accountability and stronger protection for girls. However, this gathering was intercepted and disrupted by the police, preventing organizations from delivering their statements. Since then, many women groups have faced growing challenges in organizing public advocacy or collective actions around gender-based violence. What this is showing us is that the backlash does not only target laws, it's targeting the ability for feminist movements to speak, to organize, and demand justice. What it also tells us is that access to justice is not about laws on paper, it's about power, institution, political will, and the ability for women and feminist movements to claim their rights, even in hostile environment. Despite these challenges, feminist actors across the Horn have continued to develop innovative legal and advocacy strategies, from strategic litigation to legal aid networks to community-based justice mechanisms and regional advocacy. This panel today brings together leaders working at the forefront of these efforts. Through their experience, we would explore how feminist movements are defining rights, they are advancing legal reforms, and expanding pathways to justice in the context of backlash and crisis. With that, I'm honored to introduce our distinguished panelists who bring depth expertise from across the region. And I'll be introducing our first speaker, who is Segal Abbas. Segal is a decolonial feminist policy advisor from Somalia, and she's the founder of Adapt Localization Nexus, a global South women-led agency operating in the intersection of humanitarian development peace nexus across conflict and post-conflict contexts in the Horn of Africa. She advances post-conflict recovery as a pathway to building gender equality societies, promoting women's rights, safeguarding civic space, and amplifying women-led influence in governance. Segal, as I just mentioned in my introduction, in Somalia, we often talk about backlash in terms of social and political resistance, but it can also appear through institutional delays. Several important legal reforms, including Sexual Offences Bill, we have the FGM Bill, we have the Personal Status Bill, and many more, they've remained stalled for years in different legislative processes. From your perspective, how does the legislative stagnation reflect broader backlash against gender equality? And what does it mean in terms of access to justice for women in Somalia? Thank you.
Thank you so much, and thank you for the introduction. Just to say, I'm normally used to doing work behind the scenes, so if I do get shy talking, please bear with me. So firstly, I feel like to answer this question, it's important to look at Somalia as a post-conflict country that is still trying to transition between conflict, humanitarian crisis, and also the process to rebuild its state institutions and its rule of law. So for decades, Somalia has been utilizing informal power structures, which ultimately shaped our social, political, and economic dynamics. And also to really emphasize this informal power structures really means male clan leaders determining the future for Somalia. However, to say this, since the last decade, women's rights organizations have been working towards bringing legislation for gender equality, and also most importantly, what this looked like was, as my colleague mentioned, reforms around sexual offense bill, and this was actually considered one of the most significant landmarks. It was actually putting survivor-centered approach. It really was trying to criminalize early child marriage, and also really promoting sort of protection for survivors of violence. And in fact, for a country like Somalia, this was actually one of the steps towards gender equality, and also other FGM bill as well, alongside the 30% quota. So while we were also thinking about the challenge around patriarchy and clan-based approach, women on the ground have been trying to put forward these type of gendered legislation. However, unfortunately, what happened was that we had traditional leaders and clan sort of stakeholders that were actually arguing that these reforms are against our religion, against our cultural sort of practices, and so on. And despite efforts on the political level to acknowledge the need for this, much of these reforms were either delayed, diluted, or essentially put to the backbone of our sort of legislation process. So when we think about why is this even happening, it's not because of bureaucracy inefficiency, but it also reflects our sort of competing power between the informal structures and also the process to actually rebuild our political institutions. So when I say like the power structures, I really want to emphasize also that it goes to show that clan leaders are more powerful and more influential than our political institutions, because if they are able to really put pressure on our political leaders to put these reforms in the back burn, it just goes to show that we are in a way competing both not from the patriarchal, but we also have to compete with traditional clan leaders who are often not visible. We cannot really see them on a day-to-day basis, but they're doing this behind the closed door itself. So an example of this backlash was that when the sexual offense bill was put forward and approved by the cabinet in 2018, it of course had strong opposition. So it meant that in 2020, there was an alternative proposal which literally took out everything in the original proposal and really, I would say, allowed child marriage to go forward. Also, it really diluted the protection for women and girls. And on top of that, it really took away the definition of rape itself. So this alternative bill itself has a result of traditional leaders really trying to put away these gender equitable reforms. And it was a shock because years of mobilization just completely went out the window. And again, the clan leaders themselves were able to put pressure on our political leaders itself. And what this means to women and access to justice, because when we have these reforms that are paused or delayed or even diluted, it has a triple effect. Firstly, it prevents women from accessing sort of legal services. It means that they're not able to get the protection that they need. And it essentially denies them from any access to justice in the first place. But I think also it really does this approach of like reinforcing the culture of immunity, because this new bill that was put forward, for example, it said that like essentially the clans are the ones that can identify what justice is needed. It allows the perpetrators of violence to go through this informal approach, which really doesn't put any justice to the women. And what happens in reality is that blood money is given alternatively instead of justice. So yes, survivors are limited with legal protection, weak accountability mechanism, and because of this, they are also forced to rely on these informal justice systems. So the struggle around these laws is not just about legislation, but it really just reflects on the broader struggle between whose rights and whose voices can shape Somalia's justice system. And I think up until now, yes, I know Somalia is doing its efforts to rebuild its political institution. And I mean, recently we had constitutional discussions and so on, but we have decades worth of clan leaders who have shaped our sort of country. So it's not going to take overnight for us to change, but we do need to think about alternative ways for us to also influence those clan leaders as well. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Sakal. That was really powerful and definitely interesting. We're looking forward to hear some of those strategies that we can use to influence the clan leaders when we go to the second round. I'm now going to move over to Sudan, and we have Hala Karib, who is a renowned Sudanese and African feminist activist with over 2 decades of experience in various international and regional development and humanitarian roles across Sudan, South Sudan, Eastern Africa, and Horn of Africa. Hala is the Regional Director of Strategic Initiative for Women in the Horn of Africa, my boss. And she leads organizations' efforts to empower women and promotes gender equality. Hala, I know that there's been so much conversation around Sudan, yet there's still less conversation around Sudan. We're talking, but they're not hearing and they're not listening. And you know, in Sudan today, the war has effectively dismantled many justice institutions, making it extremely difficult for women to seek protection or accountability. At the same time, existing criminal laws continue to shape how women are treated within the legal system. So from the perspective on our work at CIHA, what are the most urgent access to justice challenges that women are facing during the conflict, and how do these intersect with the broader issue of criminalization of women?
Right. So thank you, Faiza. First, I would like us to look at the whole issue of backlash within the broader context of the region, you know, and within the broader political context. You know, the undermining of the human rights framework, the lack of commitment towards enforcing the international law that keeps happening over and again, you know, and more significantly, the continuous empowerment of perpetrators and actually rewarding them with political positions. So justice cannot be separated from, from our political will to attain it. We can't keep demanding justice in an abstract, you know. And so the fact that the region, you know, we are working on, you know, political processes has not been taking, you know, accountability and the issue of holding perpetrators accountable, you know, that's in itself is laying the foundation very clearly for, for the cycle of violation to continue to occur. And this is why we have been going on cycles, you know, what Sagal has talked about in Somalia, We have been working in Somalia for over 20 years, but because of there is no framework that would hold, leadership accountable towards atrocities committed against women and girls, clearly, whether at the regional level, or at the international level. And the ongoing enabling of perpetrators. Majority of those violations are happening, as a result of the significant impunity that men with guns are enjoying. I'd also like to, before I go on, sorry, Faiza, I think we should have said that. I would like to acknowledge that we are here today also, without many of our colleagues who should have been here with us, and they never got the opportunity to be here. Yeah. To be honest with you, I felt when we were planning for CSW that I shouldn't be here. I have done my role. There is another, generations of women who should be here. I'm here because there is significant gap. Women cannot be here. Those of us who are here, we're just lucky, coincidentally, had the opportunity to be here. And that's in itself the backlash. Yeah. A significant backlash that we cannot have the space to extend solidarity to each other, learn from each other, which is quite sad and heartbreaking. The other thing, just within the whole framework of the global backlash, on women's human rights, that's manifest on lack of funding, lack of access to resources, lack of interest. People keep listening to, what we're talking about, in different platforms, but there is no action and there is no vision. And what we're saying constantly, please invite us. We will work with you. To have a roadmap, to construct strategies towards accountability, and this is one of the crises. But I just want to touch on one thing on gender facilitated violence. It's within the same issue of Sudan, and how globally this is emboldening perpetrators. When I did my interventions at the UN Security Council last month, of course there is, I'm very proud of the positive response that I have received from Sudanese communities, but also there is, violence, gender facilitated technology violence, and one of the messages that I thought about that I got, someone has compared me to the activist, that was killed in Minnesota. And he said, this is what should be done to women like me. So you can imagine, how the global environment, how the lack of accountability, is very encouraging, for perpetrators. And you can imagine how comfortable perpetrators are speaking, and threatening women rights defenders and women rights activists at the front line, and of course we cannot overcome the, the Iraqi frontline women right defender, Aniyar Muhammad, I believe, who was killed in front of her home in Iraq. So this is how high the stakes are. Our bodies at the front line, our sisters' bodies at the front line, and we are all alone, and that's really and that's really very critical, because we are talking about justice, and we are talking about accountability. So we have to address, these significant atrocities that keeps happens to women rights defenders and women who are advocating and defending universality at the front line, and what they are, and the human rights framework. In terms of Sudan, I think the war itself is the biggest backlash. We have documented at SIHA, the early days when counter-revolutions, started with the military coup, how women were, started to be violated, women protesters, by the side of the road, and clearly told that you should not be outside, that this is happening to you because you are protesting and you are outside. And I think the fact that we were out, 60% of the protesters who took over Bashir regime were women. We were very present. We were advocating for our human rights, and unfortunately, like our agenda at the time and our demands and our voices, about the volatility of the situation and the need for, strategic interventions from the international community to support the transition, of course, was not being taken seriously. Well, we are women, we are not part of the power structures. Our warning about male perpetrators who were holding control and of the country and so on. During the transitions, horrific Sudan legal framework has remained the same. There have not been any changes. It wasn't a priority. And of course, after that, Sudan has entered into this horrific era where, violence becomes violence against women becomes the law of the land, and women bodies becoming the center of atrocities and violations. And despite the fact that a region like Darfur has been under the jurisdictions of the International Criminal Court for over 25 years, and the threats and the violation that was committed against women in Darfur is known, to the international justice system. The UN Security Council in 2020 went ahead and seized the only peace mission that provided support and a level of safety and security for the women in Darfur, where they were protecting the displaced camps, they were enabling, providing patrol for women to farm and so on. So the region has become completely exposed. And the case in Darfur itself stalled. Of course, we're all aware of the disempowerment happening to the International Criminal Court as well, and that takes us back to the whole question of the international law. Having said that, working with victims day in and day out, women in Sudan still strongly believe on justice and accountability, and it's still very central in their demands, and the fact that women are willing to share their experiences, what they are going through, because they are believing that at certain point there should be an acknowledgement and a form of justice, that they would have at least gain, some form of recognitions, even if it's not their day in court, but a form of recognition that what has happened to them, is actually a crime. And this is also one of the issues that we have been struggling with, the lack of acknowledgement, of the atrocities. It means a lot, the lack of acknowledgement of atrocities that's happening to women. When it comes to our resistance and fight back at the local level, we never lose hope on frontline activists and right defenders. Despite the status of conflict, she has still, in any place where possible, to establish a network of women lawyers, women mediators, women who could actually facilitate and moderate justice for women. We do that. We have a very strong networks of women lawyers who are working on the grounds. We continue to work everywhere possible with women who are in prisons And those matters are life-saving matters, by the way. When we started working with women prisoners in Omdurman, in Greater Khartoum, we had about 25 women who were sentenced to death. You know, in war, those of you who are from war-affected countries, they know in areas where there is a post-conflict eras, you know, the fingers immediately points towards women as collaborators. Those are the women who collaborated with the enemy. So we have this issue of women being accused of being collaborators, you know, and sentenced to death. You know, so we had about over 20 or 25 cases of women being sentenced to death. We have a network of women lawyers who actually manage to, I think, exonerate about 13, and we are still working on the rest of the cases. You know, the discriminations and discriminatory laws against women. I mean, women become the target. Those of you who know the post-conflict, women become the target of violations, you know, for who they are and for morality laws. And Sudan has one of the worst morality laws. So we believe it's very critical, you know, for institutions like ours and for other people, other institutions, to take into account the importance and how critical it is to continue to support justice initiatives at all levels, you know, including mediations, local justice, when it comes to women's human rights. It's not a luxury. I know many of our partners, they would ask, oh, how can you work on justice issues in conflict situation? You can. You can do that. There is a lot of risk, but you can do that. You know, and it intersects with protections of civilians. It intersects with our principle, you know, belief in concepts of accountability, you know, and in giving communities and women, you know, hope, you know, other than militarisms and violence, you know, and in promoting, you know, and that's something we don't think about it and we don't talk about it right now, the diminishing of the human rights narrative and the diminishing of the rights, you know, and of the women's rights narratives, which is very dangerous, very, very dangerous. So I'll stop here. Sorry. Yeah, thanks, Faiza. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Alan. I think, you know, that was much needed. And thank you for also grounding us and, you know, framing the global context that we are, you know, living, and also the fact that we do not have, you know, most of our colleagues here during the CSW, which is really as a result of the backlash. We'll come back again and talk about some of the strategies, as you've clearly pointed out. Working or access to justice within conflict is possible. So we will come back and reflect on some of those ideas that we can push forward. I'll move on to Ethiopia now with Rigbe, who is a dedicated advocate for human rights and inclusion from Ethiopia. With over 18 years of experience, expertise span disability rights, women's rights, older persons' rights, children's rights, and their intersection. She's the former commissioner for women, children, and older persons and disability rights at the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission, and she's currently an expert member of the working group on the rights of older persons and persons with disability in Africa. Rigbe, Ethiopia has experienced, of course, major political transitions in recent years, and we've also seen the civic shrinking space. I gave an example earlier, and human rights advocacy. From your perspective, what are the main barriers, you know, for access to justice to women and girls, and particularly marginalized groups such as women with disability and older women? You know, what do they face when seeking justice?
I'm not sure I can get there. Okay, yeah. Is it okay?
Thank you so much, Faizat. Good morning, everyone. So in recent transitions and political situations in Ethiopia have further hampered access to justice for women, and particularly for women with disabilities and older persons and other women in vulnerable situations. There are three scenarios when talking about, when talking about criminal justice. There are women in conflict zones in Ethiopia, in different regions in Ethiopia, and who are currently experiencing conflict-related gender-based violence. There are also women who have experienced gender-based violence from past conflicts and who are still awaiting justice. And we also have women in non-conflict areas who are denied of access to justice and who are experiencing gender-based violence. So we look at these three scenarios when we talk about access to justice for women in Ethiopia. And it's not just about substantive and procedural laws. We're talking about different physical, attitudinal, institutional, communication, information barriers, and economic barriers that hinder women from accessing justice. And when we talk about physical barriers, we're talking about availability. We don't have the justice structures in place sometimes. And if they're there is a distance issue, there's accessibility issue, there's transportation safety issue. So women are not able to access those organs of the state, which protects them in these situations. And there's also internal environmental accessibility issues for women with disabilities. And we also talk about communication barriers. We talk about language barriers. And we also talk about sign language when we talk about language barriers. And women with disabilities, also older women, also face these communication barriers when they try to access justice. And we also talk about attitudinal barriers. These are practices in justice sector where there's a lot of victim blaming. Victims are blamed for the violence that happened to them. And there's also this charity-based approach towards women with disabilities who have experienced abuse and violence rather than a rights-based approach. And there's also this violence among families, which is a taboo. So a lot of violence happen within families, within close kinships, and they're not reported because it's a taboo, and they remain unaddressed. And when we talk about legal and procedural issues, there are substantive and procedural gaps in the legal framework. There is inadequate protection to address the needs of various women in different situations. The criminal procedure code and the evidence code in Ethiopia is very outdated, and it's been in the process of being revised for a lot of time now, and it's now on pause for different reasons. And procedurally, there is multiple victimization of women after they experience violence because there's no confidentiality, and women are required to tell their stories to different actors in the justice sector and elsewhere, and they are exposed to double victimization because of that. And we have one-stop centers in different parts which are supposed to provide holistic support to women, but they're not functional because of resource and other issues. And women are also not adequately protected from retaliatory violence from perpetrators and from community after they experience the violence. And there are not enough shelters to protect women who have experienced violence, who are victims of violence, and they're exposed to further violence in these cases. And of course, women in conflict zones lack protection and response to violence, gender-based violence, because justice and health centers are not partially or fully, they're not functional. So they don't get, cases are not reported, but also they don't get the response, even health response to these violences. And because of that, GBV cases remain unreported and untreated in these cases. And as we know, the journey towards transitional justice started a few years back in Ethiopia, but it's now on pause, and we're not seeing any progress from the side of the government for various reasons. And I would like also to touch upon the shrinking civic space in Ethiopia and the digital violence. The government is revisiting civil society law, media law, and it's coming up with restrictive measures. As a result, women are losing their voices in shaping policies and advocating for their rights. And the online backlash, which also spills over offline. There's hate campaigns, technology facilitated gender-based violence leading to death threats, stalking, physical assault, internal displacement, and exile. Women human rights defenders have exiled due to these reasons. And also, one more thing I want to add is in this shrinking space, civil societies have been advocating for family laws in different regions in Ethiopia, because there are still regions that do not have family laws. But regional governments are moving towards formalizing traditional justice systems, which leave family issues to these traditional justice systems, but these systems are gender ignorant and they're not sensitive to different situations of women who experience violence, but also women who have family issues and who go to this justice sectors. But now they're opening it up for systems that are not really accommodative of the different needs of women. I'll stop here. Thank you so much, Faisal.
Thank you so much, Lupi. I'll go to our last speaker, Elizabeth, from FIDA Uganda, who is also a dedicated women's rights lawyer and policy advocate. She's the advocacy and policy manager at FIDA Uganda, and her work centers on translating complex legal frameworks into practical tools to protect women. Elizabeth, Uganda has functioning legal systems, so we've had lack of, legal systems, passing of bills. We've had collapse of legal system in Sudan, but here we have a functioning legal system, that ideally should address violence against women. But what we've seen is that many survivors still struggle to obtain justice. From your work at FIDA Uganda, what are the structural gaps, between law and women's lived experience when they seek legal redress?
Thank you very much. I'd just like to use a minute to just say a thing about FIDA. So FIDA is the association that brings together women lawyers, just like there are several that bring together individuals in different sectors of work. But we also double as a feminist NGO that has been in existence now 52 years. So I'll be speaking from that kind of experience. And quite honestly, Uganda prides itself in having a very strong legal framework, right, in being able to address violence against women. There's been relatively good response from government to say, let's ratify C-190 to make sure that we do away with violence in the place of work and sexual harassment. The Domestic Violence Act was a huge one that FIDA was part of. The FGM Act was also one that was very good. And the international conventions, we're doing very, very well, right? However, like the question says, there's a gap between what is on paper and what practically a survivor works with to access justice. And that's what I'll be speaking about real quick. One, I really think that we do not have enough courts spread across the country. And that comes for a lot of criminal matters. And I think that's a concern for us because of the high number of cases of sexual violence in Uganda. I must remind us that with that problem, we're also still dealing with the fact that there are little gaps in there. I'll give an example. That marital rape in Uganda is not a crime. It's not written anywhere in our laws. Yet FIDA continues to get clients, married women who come and say, this happened to me right after giving birth. I remember last year we got a client who spoke about, I think she had just given birth 2 weeks, and the husband demanded that he has sex with her. And when she rejected the fact that she wanted to have sex with him, he asked to have anal sex with her. And he went ahead and did whatever he had to do. And this client came to ask for help, but she did not come to report her husband. She came to seek for help for the pain that she was feeling. And that for me spoke to me, right? You're saying you are forced into this, but that's not even the concern that brought her. It was the fact that she had never experienced this thing and she's looking for some health assistance. So for me, I think that stuck with me. So one, we do not have enough courts for especially criminal matters in certain areas. I know you're not familiar with the geographical area, but I'll just give you an example. We have 5 districts very far away from the city center that only share one chief magistrate's court. Now, we know that the chief magistrate's court does not have mandate to handle some of the capital matters like rape and defilement. So it means that someone gets on a bus for at least 3 days before they get to the chief magistrate's court to be able to have their case heard. This is usually met by matters like case backlog. Recently, our team lead, Lillian, had a meeting with the Chief Justice, who is very new. And he was honest. He mentioned that right now, the high court circuits across the country are handling cases from 2004. So it means for cases of 2005, for everything that we filed, none of that is getting heard yet. Now imagine you have a client who came in with all the different, challenges that women face to get to a point of reporting, and then you never get a hearing date for over 2 years, and that's if you're lucky. So I feel like that's truly a challenge. I also want to speak about the challenge in the difference between what the law says, indeed, like the question says. For the last 3 years, actually for the last 5 years in Uganda, the state, the head of state has the prerogative of mercy that is a right by the constitution. So he can excuse certain people who have been sentenced to certain offenses. I'll give you an example that the last 3 lists that we have seen on the list of prerogative of mercy, there's been no woman. Secondly, out of the list in 2004, which was 11 people, 8 of them were offenders of sexual violence, including defilement. Then I think we had one public official that was in a very huge scandal of Chogam when we hosted. And for us, we're asking, what message are you sending to perpetrators if you know that at the end of the day, someone is going to be forgiven because of prerogative of mercy? We are currently challenging and writing to the committee to see if there's something that could be done about that. I also want to speak about the reality of different women in different sectors. While FIDA does not have work directly with sex workers and LGBTI women, but that's a lived reality in Uganda, that for a sex worker, then there's double, vulnerability to be able to access justice at the end of the day. The other challenge between the law and the lived reality in terms of seeking justice is non-believability of victims, especially girls and women. Whenever there's a sexual offense that has been done against a woman, people begin to profile, community begin to profile. How are you dressed? I'll give you an example just today. I'm a very radical woman. I dress as much as comfortably as I feel. Just today morning, someone from government at the debrief we're having at the Uganda House asked me, are you walking around with something as short as that to speak at an official event? And I was just wondering, where does someone get the audacity to ask an adult something like that? But that's what happens, that when a victim comes out, we had a client at Makerere University, which is the biggest university in Uganda. There's a wave of students complaining that there are men who use the dark spots around the university, places that do not have light, to grope them. But also for the bars and entertainment areas around Makerere, there's a trend in 2004, where men would go to those bars because they know they are university students and they would spike their drinks. It informed our work on recommending that the sexual offences bill should speak to that newer form of violence, where someone spikes your drink with an intention to commit a sexual offence. And I'm very glad to see that this is already in our sexual offences bill, and I do hope that it does not change face. And there's a girl who reported, and I remember immediately she posted it on Twitter. People started to ask, what were you doing outside a hostel room at 10 p.m.? Okay, how was she dressed? Who are you with? Who did you report to? Why are you coming out 3 days later? Why didn't you immediately go to the police? That derails a lot of clients to come through to report some of these cases. Then the evidence burden. Ladies and gentlemen, as a lawyer, some of the things that I grapple with is just making sure that my clients have enough evidence to support their matter. There's nothing as painful as walking this journey with your client and you're defeated on evidence purposes. I'll give an example. When someone is defiled or raped, or assaulted, they're supposed to fill, in our country, it's the police form 3. So it's that police form that shows what kind of damage was done, how much it was, who is the perpetrator, and etc. But currently, you find police selling those forms. And at the cell, this is primary evidence in any sexual offences matter. Without it, it means I have to take the route of corroboration of my evidence. Many clients never have that form because they don't get the opportunity. So immediately they tell them that they go back home. They shower, they begin to say, let's go to the local chairperson, let's call the child's father, who is the head of the family, to make a decision for us. By the time FIDA comes into the picture, there's no primary evidence. And those cases, ladies and gentlemen, are just so difficult to deal with when you do not have evidence in a criminal matter, because you have to prove beyond reasonable doubt. So your client walks away feeling unfairly treated, but there's not much you can do because that's what the law says. Secondary trauma. I really think a lot of our processes engage secondary trauma. When you look at the news with this digitalization of everything, there's usually comments that leave you dumbfolded. You're wondering, how is it possible that a person thinks this is okay to say about a client? It derails clients, it defeats the purpose, but also I feel like there's lack of accountability for that secondary trauma that a lot of clients face. So it makes it difficult for clients to utilize the legal framework that is available to access justice. My sister earlier spoke about the cultural and informal justice mechanisms. In FIDA Uganda, we handle about 20,000 to 25,000 cases a year across the 26 districts where we operate at the moment. And more than 65% of our cases the last 5 years have been handled through alternative dispute resolutions or through informal justice actors who we empower by training, by building capacity, by creating platforms where they interface with the formal justice actors to agree on what is evidence for informal justice actors. The challenge is that a lot of informal justice actors are extremely patriarchal. We have clients who have come to say to us, but they advised me to forgive him. This is a client who is raped a child, a stepchild. You know, and what do you mean you're forgiving a criminal matter? We have had instances where informal justice actors in certain areas say you cut a cow or a goat, you use the blood to cleanse the person and then back into the community. So there is that usually discourages the work of FIDA. What we've done in response is to work with informal actors to see what does actually justice look like, because we can't eradicate them. A lot of people believe in them. Right? They believe, and also we must agree that justice or the process is a lot faster. You may not take a year to get a hearing date in a local council court like you will at the High Court. Immediately when an offense happens today, the next day, it's possible that you have a council sitting to listen to your matter. So we are doing a lot of empowerment of that to ensure we handle. And then lastly, but not in any way least, I wanted to touch something on the witness protection law. Uganda has frustrated all efforts on the witness protection law. And the damage this is doing, I'll give you an example, is that in cases of externalization of labor, I don't know if this is something you're experiencing in your countries where there are lots of girls and boys that leave to go to the Gulf countries to work. Now, if you go to a country like Saudi Arabia that only allowed for women to drive like 5 years ago, right, where women are not allowed to work in certain workspaces without men escorting them, how do you expect a black woman who comes to work for them in the domestic arena to be treated? It's extremely frustrating, and a lot of that work has been frustrated because when they do return and they would like to sew, it's a lot difficult for them to stay as witnesses because these companies have a lot of money. These companies, when you go to our Uganda Registration Bureau to find out who are the company directors, one of them, this I'm not afraid to say because it's on public record, was a former permanent secretary of the Ministry of Gender and Local Development. So this is one of the directors of a company that takes people abroad, but people come back dead, or people come back without their minds. People come back and they're depressed. We've had a client who died by suicide because of the trauma they experienced. Why do I relate this to the Witness Protection Bill? Because many times when those clients come and they have witnesses who are also fellow girls that they did go with, they get paid off. Or they get threatened by these companies that we shall find you, we have the mechanisms to find you. We've had cases where you will call a client and they will stop picking. And later someone tells you, but you know, they met some gentleman, gave them money, we were worried. So then even your witnesses are scared to come up because they know something wrong might happen. So lastly is the transitional justice work. And my sister from Ethiopia spoke about it, so I added it right here. A lot of the work on transitional justice in Uganda stalled during COVID and has not picked up. When the cameras left northern Uganda where this war was, even the government moved its lens to something else. The trouble is that FIDA is now in the 9th year. Before I joined FIDA filed a matter for reparations of sexual violence for victims in the war. Ladies and gentlemen, we've only had one hearing date last year, one. And this was filed before I joined FIDA in 2018. I'm just giving you this example to show you just how long it's going to take you to get reparations, right? So those are some of the challenges that we see between even having a legal framework that works and what justice means to many of the clients that we work with.
Thank you so much. Actually, a round of applause for all our panelists for giving us really amazing nuggets. And I think what we've heard so far, we've heard from different panelists, something that kept on coming back, that I kept on hearing, was one, lack of accountability, and the circle of impunity across the region in every context was something that kept on reflecting and something that kept on coming out. I was also hearing a lot about re-traumatization being one of the biggest issues for access to justice. And then also the religious and traditional clan-based system being one of the biggest rollback and one of the biggest challenges to access to justice. Before we go into our panelists sharing solutions and resistance, because I'm also mindful of time, I would like to open the floor and just to hear some comment, feedback, reflection from the floor, from participants. So I would start with, I saw that hand first, 1, 2, 3, and then we'll go again.
Should I face you guys?
I think you face everyone.
Where's the camera? Okay, there.
So, it's clear dignity and rights of all humans and women should be respected and upheld. And unfortunately, some don't even get to experience the most basic right, and this emboldens perpetrators of violence against women. So my question to the panel is, how do you feel about the violation and lack of justice of the most vulnerable females, the ones not yet birthed and their right to life not upheld? Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you so much. Good afternoon. My name is Stephanie Musho Newbold. I'm a human rights lawyer based in Nairobi, Kenya. I think I have 4 points to bring up, and this was an amazing discussion. One, when we're talking about gender backlash, I think it's important to talk about foreign influence on women's rights in Africa, specifically around our sexual and reproductive health and rights. There's a lot, and when we're thinking about strategies, I think it's important to name, because we must know our adversaries. We have Citizen Go, and I'm unafraid to say this. We have Family Watch International. We have CFAM. They run on a Christian platform, and they talk about family values. In Kenya, we've seen this. In Uganda, we've seen this, where they say, God hates divorce. And there's a lot of gender-based violence happening. So what? Women should leave their marriages in body bags, for example. Is that what we're saying? When we're talking about law, I think it's also important to think about, for example, the African Bar Association has been captured by global anti-rights, anti-gender, anti-rights movement. Kenya has been captured by this. We have Charles Kanjama, who has just been elected the president of the Law Society of Kenya. He is anti-gender, anti-rights. What are we doing to ensure that even in the different legal spaces, the bar associations, the East African Court of Justice, the different courts of justices across Africa are not being captured by the same opposition that is driving this gender backlash? And then finally, we have Uganda that is sponsoring or is pushing this African Charter on family values, which is a problem. I think it's important that we talk about this and we strategize on how to counter that. And finally, there's the interparliamentary conference on family values that's coming up at the end of May. This is also driven by foreign influence on Africa. This happened in Uganda last year and in Kenya. They're now moving to Accra. I know Accra is non-conflict, but we have to be proactive and preemptive around safeguarding our spaces and stop letting foreign influence dictate the rights of women, girls, and gender minorities in Africa. Thank you so much for this great discussion.
So good afternoon, good morning, everyone. Maybe mine is just a follow-up question to what she just shared now. To say maybe part of what I really want to see, maybe before we leave today, is just to find out, she spoke about the religious and traditional leaders being one of the major rollback they found in her country. So I would just want us to just think her through, are there countries, are there areas, are there strategies that have been used somewhere that would actually use in other countries to just make sure this doesn't happen again? Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, and good morning, everyone. My name is Julia Washav. I'm from Mozambique, lawyer and women rights defenders as an activist. Congratulations for the conversation and the presentations. I have a question for Uganda. In Uganda, you have traditional courts? If you have, for example, in Mozambique, the traditional court is led by judge men. So do you have a judge women, or the women have access to be a judge for the traditional court? Because the most of community lives on the rural areas, like in the communities. So they're scaring to go to the court. But where they live in the community, they have access to the traditional courts. They're scaring to go there because there are men's there, leader, men's, and this patriarchal and all those issues. Thank you.
Thank you so much for those questions. Okay, I'll take one more, and then we go back to the panelists. We'll still have another round.
All right, thank you so much. So, hello everyone, my name is Ella and I'm from Ghana. So like most of the stuff that we discussed was like basically connecting to my country. And I have like two questions. So the first one was, how can international institutions support like local feminist movement without undermining their autonomy? And then my last one is, how can strategic litigation be used not only to challenge discriminatory laws, but also like to transform societal attitude towards like gender equality? So.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Yes. So last question. On strategy. Which one? Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to, I don't know who wants to start. Okay, leave it open. Okay. And then.
Thank you very much. I want to start with the last question on strategic interest litigation, which is something that we have explored. One, what an expensive process. It's just so expensive. I remember when the DGF fund, the Democratic Governance Fund, was still working in Uganda, before it was literally chased by the head of state because of its support to NGOs that were thought to be opposition. I remember a donor we wrote a report to, and they said, you want to tell me for the last 5 years we began this project, this is the one update that you have. No hearing date. No, client has changed their minds. Strategic litigation is a very good way we could change laws, though. We saw the return of bride price in Uganda being outlawed through strategic litigation by FIDA. And this is something right now that we are using to lobby that it's also included in our marriage bill for it to be there, right? So strategic litigation, while a good tool, is extremely expensive. A lot of development partners do not have a lot of interest in supporting it because there are no quick gains. In a year, you could only have one hearing if you're lucky. There is plenty of work that goes in there that a lot of development partners are not willing to fund. But by and large, it is such a beautiful process on engaging communities to be part of. Our case that I was talking about for reparations in northern Uganda, we have over 200 women that actually filed their affidavits in support of this matter. But many of them keep dying off, many of them, because of the delay in hearing of the matter. But quite honestly, strategic litigation is something that I feel that could also help us in having regional alliances with institutions that are also doing legal aid, because the more the merrier for some of those things. The second one is institutional. I wanted to respond to the SRHR question. I think the trend in Kenya, sort of the wind blows into Uganda and the neighboring districts many times. And Uganda also became a party to a lot of this work from international bodies that are pushing family, like their policies. Actually, Uganda, through the Ministry of Gender, did pass a national family policy that talks about a mother and father and children as what a family is. And in a country like Uganda, that's very unfair, even if you're not a lawyer, because that's not what a family is for many of the Ugandans. But there's a lot of support from the institutions she was talking about. They actually flew in to have this pushed. I've not seen a policy run through the process so fast like the national family policy, right? A lot of it is patriarchal, so I think it's important as we organize, we look into what this external support looks like and what it's pushing for. Just for our information, in Uganda, abortion, which is part of SRHR, is restricted. So either you have been raped or there's a life of a mother that is under risk. Outside that, we've had instances where doctors get arrested for procuring abortions, even the girls. And you have seen the backlash on Mary Stop's work and its visibility in Uganda, particularly in actually Kenya too. So yeah, that's something we may need to look into because abortion is still part of SRHR. Yeah. I wanted to also mention something about what my sister asked, which is on the traditional courts. Yes, back at home we call them local council courts. But I need you to know that the last 2 phases of elections that were supposed to happen of these people, the government had to postpone because there was no money for it. So we still have those that were in the last regime that are still doing the work. But some of them do really amazing work because they do respond to issues immediately. The challenge we get is that many of them are men, and very old patriarchal men. So many times when women get scared to go and report, especially instances of rape, also instances of domestic violence where the man is the perpetrator. Because usually when you go, they will tell you, this is a private matter. Why are you even bringing it into the public space? And as feminists, I think it's important that we go back to actually creating a lot of awareness of this line that is getting drawn between the public and private space, because it's not there, right? It's being created by people that are really against some of these rights. And then lastly, you asked about judges. Uganda currently has 38% as judges who are women, and many of them organize through the association, but there's still a lot of work that is being done to ensure that we get more judges and women in as legal officers in these courts.
Thank you so much. I actually really like your point. I don't know if this is working. It is working. Okay, yeah. I really like the point about your mention around preventing intervention into like our feminist agenda. And it links back to her first question, what is the role of international community in supporting feminist movement? So from a decolonial perspective, we actually asked that question, like, what does funding look like through a flexible approach that allows us to set our own agenda? And one of the biggest challenge I've noticed within the feminist gender space is that it's actually being decided in the global north. And then what they like for us to do is like design our own program and suit it for them, right? So a lot of the work that we're trying to do is actually say, we know our contextual communities. We know the language that we can frame it. So we don't want to put our own communities at risk, especially around like sensitive gender conversation, just for the donor, right? So it's a question that we're still asking, what is the answer? But one thing I do appreciate the work that we're doing in our young feminist space is that we are not going to sell ourselves just to get funding. And we always say that if we want to have more of an impactful gender sort of solution, we have to be the one designing the program. What is our feminist agenda? And a lot of that actually means that we need to sit with local traditional leaders and really make it not like we're against you or we're trying to promote a Western feminist agenda. So one answer or one thing I would like for the international community, if anything, is that when you're giving us funding, allow us to take the lead, right? And don't dictate what is our message. Because we have a lot of things that we want to work on, but we're being restricted. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you so much again. I just want to add to what Sagal just raised in terms of, we get a lot of the backlash, especially at local level. We also get them from women. So are we designing movements that speak to the women, that speak to their values, to their context? Sometimes that's why we also experience those backlashes. So one of my recommendations is to have, as a feminist movement, as feminist organizations, to strategize in a way to contextualize, as Sagal said, in a way that speaks to the values, to the context, to the religious values, to the traditional values of these women, which are also in line with the human rights, basic human rights values, of course. So I think working around that also helps in terms of preventing the backlash and also reversing the backlash. I also want to add, in terms of the traditional justice system that we have, I wanted to give an example of a woman who was whipped, beaten in public as part of the traditional reconciliation process, as part of the traditional justice process, where there were elders leading the whipping and the beating of the woman who refused to be in a marriage that was not serving her right. So she was public. There was a video going around of this woman who was beaten, and she was being beaten, I think, by her husband in front of the elders and other people and her children. So this is a male-dominated and really gender ignorant, and I don't know. It violates a lot of the women's rights at their basics. So this is what's happening when we talk about the traditional justice system that we are allowing women to be served with. So yes, I just wanted to add that. Thank you so much.
No, thank you. I mean, I'm just going to speak on the same line. I think our strategy in CIHA is always to engage, not to turn our back, whether with the communities that we are working with. And, and the women should not be put in a position to choose between their identity, who they are, cultural identity or their faith, and their access to human rights. And that should not be the case. And I think, and I completely understand, your position and where you're coming from and the influence, of the international community on the current backlash that is happening in Africa. I think we really need to re-strategize and reposition ourselves as movements, and seriously and I'm going to be very openly self-critical of women organization and our NGOizations of the movement and all this, we need to leave the closed rooms and be very serious in terms of our engagements with women at the grassroots level. Majority of the women we are working with, in our context, are poor women. And they are women who doesn't have access, to the type of workshops and cycles of awareness that's done in closed rooms, and so it's really important to be very serious in creating strategies and models, that's easily being adopted and taken forward, by the movement on the grounds. We have significant experience, SIHA has significant experience of not quitting working with traditional leaders. We are not intimidated by them. We're not afraid of them. And you have to continue to challenge them. You will be accused of all kind of things. You will be demonized. But that's what it takes for change to happen. And this is what's expected, from a feminist movement, because we're not changing only the small circles, that we are changing, communities. And so that's really very, very important to take into account. Thanks.
Thank you so much. I'm going to go back to our panelists and, to kind of close us up, to share some of the strategies, I think, for each of you, based on the conversation that we've had. What are some of the strategies or the resistance strategies that you've used in your work to try to, counter this backlash or promote women's access to justice? So again, I'll start from the left. I'll start with you, Elizabeth. What are some of the legal strategies or interventions that have proven most effective in helping the survivors navigate the justice system and obtain meaningful redress?
First of all, let me just use a minute to recognize Sihanet. I think Sihanet is a development partner who's given FIDA money for the last 5 years to engage with women in the grassroots. And I remember the co-creation process of this work, the questions that were asked: where are the women? How shall we make sure their voices are in the room? Let most of the budget go to the grassroots women and empowering them to speak and have agency. And I think for me, that's an example for me to use on what funding should look like, a negotiation for you to say this will not work and this will work. And we had the opportunity each year, to go back and say, this is not working. Can we do this instead? But we have also had development partners that are unable to listen to something like that. So when you sign for the next 3 years, if it's $30 for A, $30 will be for A till the 3 years elapse. So thank you very much, Siha, for walking the talk. Yeah. So quickly, I think one, mobile legal aid clinics. I mentioned earlier that we do not have courts in most of the districts. To give you context, in Uganda, almost every year we have different districts. They keep dividing different districts into others. And the intention is that the ruling party would like to have as many members of parliament on their side in parliament as possible. So if we have about 200 districts and they add other 15, it means they have more 15 members of parliament that can vote in favor of their work in parliament. So that's very commonplace back home. But the problem is that the social structures do not match the new districts that are created to do this political work. And one of such social services is courts. So what we usually do is that we work with the courts to move the judges to different villages. So we agree that today we are going to village A and we tell the judge these are the files for this particular matter. So that day they will sit in the community, hear those cases, and then close them as quickly as possible. It helps a lot with case backlog, but also we have seen it sort of build confidence of communities in seeking justice from these systems. And then secondly, legal empowerment. And many times as legal aid service providers, we do a lot of legal literacy, but not empowerment. Many people will know that I cannot be beaten because it's not legal, right? But are they able to use this legal knowledge to seek for justice for that beating that they have received? Many of them can't, because they can't go to the police, because they're going to ask you to take a statement. They're going to ask for, bring your witnesses to make a statement, and then wait for some few hours, and then sit there, and then, so a lot of legal empowerment has also improved in how women, especially young girls, access justice. We have seen women now who stand in court and actually self-represent. I'd like to recognize FIDA Kenya. I know it's not in this room, but we do have a FIDA Kenya where we did learn this, where they do self-representation. And imagine it was a response to the fact that projects end and cases are still ongoing in court. So what happens? So you leave clients with no lawyers until when another donor comes on board. So we started to do the initiatives of ensuring that clients can self-represent in some of these matters, e.g. custody matters, maintenance, and etc. And then lastly, one of the things we've also done is strategic interest litigation, to make sure you overhaul the system altogether.
Thank you. Sorry, we do have 8 minutes or thereabout left, so 3 minutes each, so that we can all get.
So just to quickly emphasize, despite all the challenges and the barriers in Somalia, one thing that has been really successful is the consistency of the feminist movement. So even if they're being blocked, even if these reforms are being stalled, some of these women's organizations are consistently still putting themselves out there. And I think I want to highlight that part more, because I feel like when it comes to feminist resistance, even your existence and you putting yourself in these spaces, I think that alone is revolutionary, because it just shows to the men you're not going to give up, right? And you're still going to bother them until they start acknowledging these type of gender reforms and legislation. So consistency is definitely one of the top successful impact. Another thing I also wanted to mention also around like reframing, like the idea, I mean, I don't like when people say gender is to westernized tool or is too westernized, but what we try to do is like, okay, if this is considered too westernized, we can also bring Islam into this too. So we're using the Quran and Islam in a way to justify basic human rights for women and girls, especially when we're engaging with the sheikhs, for example. Another thing also as well is framing it in a health-based approach. So one of our federal member states, Galmudug, was actually the first to actually put the FGM bill into law. And the reason for this actually is because women's organization started to say, okay, you know what, the best way to actually bring this forward is use health to really justify why we need to ban FGM. And it was actually really successful, because it didn't put these traditional leaders in like a corner and so on. And on top of it, another successful thing as well is that the law itself is one element. Another thing that was critical as well is that they identified women's sort of economic sort of connection to the practice. So the law was put forward, but then women's organizations said that we actually have to have economic re-empowerment. So the women who are practicing the FGM itself are not going to be jobless anymore, and they're going to find other ways of maintaining their economic livelihood. Another point I wanted to mention as well, online activism honestly had a lot of impact for Somali women. So whenever any of these laws, or the reforms were being pushed back, we utilized the X. I mean, unfortunately now is not the best place, but we utilized Facebook, Twitter, for example, to really bring forward these sensitive conversations. If we're not able to go outside and protest, online spaces is literally the best thing for us when it comes to feminist resistance. So I don't know if that was 1 minute.
Ruby, I'm going to go over to you. 3 minutes.
Thank you. So all the recommendations also apply to Ethiopia, of course, but I would like to add about intersectional, gender-responsive, human rights-based capacity building. A lot of the work that are done on gender usually are not inclusive. For example, women with disabilities, older women, or children with disabilities, or female children in general. So making those sensitizations, training to both duty bearers and rights holders inclusive, and also having that intersectional lens is always it's always important. And when we co-design this strategies, these trainings, these sensitizations, it should be with organizations of persons with disabilities, networks of older persons, women's groups, all these youth groups, and so on. So really looking at the intersectional lens is really important, and making accessibility non-negotiable because it's a basic human rights, and we should also put accountability measures in that aspect. In terms of legal knowledge, it has already been raised, but also having this intersectional lens is very important. And in protecting civic space defenders, human rights defenders who are being attacked, we need rapid response and risk assessments for women human rights defenders, including emergency relocations and psychosocial support, legal support. That needs to be there. And of course, we also need to strengthen the inclusive peace and justice initiatives that we have started. They need to resume, they need to be resourced, and they need to meaningfully involve women in all their diversities in this process. I'll add 2 more points on strengthening independent human rights monitoring mechanisms, like national human rights institutions. These are very important machineries that come up with independent reports and bring about accountability. And my last point, we need strong intersectional women, disability, youth, and community coalitions to counter this backlash and push for human rights-based policy, oversee implementation, and scale up impact. Yes, thank you so much.
I would like just to stress, a category that's not been mentioned often in this presentation, the issue of women prisoners. So we live in a region and we work in a region where there is massive number of women who were held as prisoners without charges. And some of them, they've been held for years without access to legal aid, without access to any form of assistance, and some they die, and just speaking about Sudan at this critical moment, there is thousands of women who are detained by the RSF in Darfur that we don't even have information about them or what's happening to them, usually the negotiations, communities, they negotiate on behalf of men, but with women, nobody is negotiating or bargaining on their behalf for their release. So they end up being in detention for a very long time. In many of the cities that's under the control of Sudan Armed Forces, we have hundreds of women who were jailed, without access to legal aid. So continue to support, networks of advocates, of lawyers, of frontline defenders who has the capacity to reach out to those women and to speak on their behalf. That's very critical, in sustaining justice in conflict and post-conflict situation. Female lawyers in particular, we need to really double and triple our support for lawyers network on ground. That's an issue. And they have the capacity to create a shift, to release women, to save life, support women mediators and women who deal with traditional authorities. And as Rikba said, we should always engage and not to isolate ourselves or turn our back, to the local mechanisms, local institutions, because without them, the work cannot be done. So those will be my points. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Sue. all our panelists. First of all, thank you to everyone for joining us today. Thank you to our panelists for the wonderful insight. We've heard about the issues, but we've also had a lot of information about the strategies and ways that we can counter this. We've heard about, legal awareness and education being one of it, legal aid being another. We've also had the importance of digital advocacy as a tool for us in one of the strategies, engaging in alternative languages, using the religion itself as a tool, in ensuring that the policies and the laws we're asking for are accepted. We've also heard very clearly and loudly that funding practices must change. It cannot continue the way it is. Donors have to listen and understand that we do know our issues and we do know how to address them, and trust that we know how to address them. So very critical and important for us to take on. But something else that also came out strongly, as Rigby also spoke, was the intersectional coalitions. And I think more and more we are also trying to see, when we're looking at the intersectional, we're also looking at the intergenerational as well, which is very, very important as this part of process. So ultimately, I would like to close with saying that our panel has shown that, the backlash is, beyond our region, is global, it's real. It has daily consequences for women and girls in the region, and we must continue. One of the biggest things that came out is also the feminist organizing. So continue to use our feminist organizing to counter this backlash. We must be strategic. We must work together as coalitions in order for us to be able to counter the backlash that is very coordinated. So thank you so much to our panelists. We're really grateful. Thank you to all of you for coming. Thank you to our donors as well, Combo and IMS Foundation, for making this possible. Thank you.